In today's video, we're going to be talking about Heidegger's term dasman, which is roughly translatable to the they. Now, to me, dasman is similar to Hegel's Geist in terms of the difficulties with understanding exactly what it is and exactly how it interacts with people. But I think in some ways, dasman and Geist are polar opposites of one another. Hegel and Heidegger take very different stances on the function of social being, and I think Heidegger's is quite different from Hegel's take, which, is very rooted in that German spirit of freedom and kind of, I don't exactly know how to explain it, but I think Heidegger's is a lot more French to me. It is echoed a lot more in Salta. I think of No Exit. His play No Exit is kind of very much a commentary on Das Man and exactly how humans relate to other humans in the world. Now, exactly what Heidegger is trying to say when he uses the term Das Man is a little confusing. He says on page 164 of the McCrory Robinson translation of Being in Time, he says, "The who is not this one, not that one, not oneself, not some people, and not the sum of them all. The who is the neuter, the they, das Man." And he basically says that das Man is this ambiguous they that is referred to whenever we go about our daily lives in the world. And they influence us quite greatly. He talks a little bit and says, in one's concern with what one has taken hold of, whether with, for, or against the others, there is constant care as to the way one differs from them, whether that difference is merely one that is to be evened out, whether one's Dasein has lagged behind the others and wants to catch up in relationship to them, or whether one's Dasein already has some priority over them and sets out to keep them suppressed. The care about this distance between them is disturbing to being with one another, though this disturbance is one that is hidden from it. If we may express this existentially, such being with one another has the character of distantiality, Abständigkeit. The more inconspicuous this kind of being is to everyday Dasein itself, all the more subtly and primordially does it work itself out. Now, basically what he's trying to say here is that when we orient ourselves towards the world, there is an other which we orient ourselves towards. This would kind of be society. When we talk about we as a society, insert some sort of personal quip or something there. But, we talk about as a society, we need to do this. Or when we talk about people say this, it's these sort of weasel words that Heidegger wants to play around with and see this as kind of a weasel concept, per se, not to necessarily imply the pejorative. But we kind of get a glimpse into this when we read Hegel's master-slave dialectic, because, of course, Hegel is, and it's also called Lordship and Bondage is another translation of it. That's the one that's used in the Miller translation. But the idea of the master-slave dialectic is something like, how does the independent consciousness gain an identity of itself? And Hegel says that we require something which is another in order for the self to be distinguished as a thing. If there was nothing else out there, we would have no way of referencing to ourselves, because, of course, when you reference a particular point, you're assuming that there are other points with which you are pointing in reference to. So Hegel says that we need the other in in an effort to give ourselves an identity. And there's this sort of fight that he talks about, this push and pull in which we need the other in order to make our identity concrete. Yet we also need the entirety of the other to be enslaved to us and given subservience toward us in an effort to maximize our being understood. But of course, this goes both ways. So Hegel sees this sort of interplay of bondage as kind of the master-slave dialectic. But of course, he sees this as happening both ways, and he says that we need to be slaves in a way, because if we were complete masters, we would dissolve the other, and we would simply return to the starting point that was the problem of how do we give a concrete identity to something that's all on its own. So not only does one need that lordship or that mastery over another in order to have their identity recognized, they also need to have that bondage or that slavery or that sense of being subservient to something that they can tangibly know is there. So there's a certain duality in the understanding of social relations in Hegel, but in Heidegger it becomes much more of the first side, in which there's this constant fight or war that's going on between people trying to fight for their identity. And dasman is a deficient mode of being. He opposes the authentic versus inauthentic self by saying the self of everyday Dasein is the they self, which we distinguish from the authentic self, that is, from the self which has been taken hold of in its own way. So there's this taking hold of the self in its own way, which dasman seeks to get in the way of. And the way it does this is by forcing you into a deficient mode of being. He says, in this inconspicuousness and unascertainability, the real dictatorship of the they is unfolded. We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking. The they, dasman, which is nothing definite, in which all are, though not as the sum, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. So the entirety of Division 1 of Being in Time is primarily focused on this sort of unreflected mode of being, or this deficient mode of being, exactly how Dasein is in its everydayness. And this is an important thing, is that of course we're always in social relations. And Heidegger doesn't see this social relation as merely being necessarily between people. As he said earlier, the who is not this one, not that one, not oneself, not some people, and not the sum of them all. He says it's this neuter, dasman. It's this other that you can't quite quantify, but always seems to be in the back of your head. For example, when you're picking an outfit and you have that subtle voice that is tempting you to choose one outfit over the other in hopes that it might be recognized as more trendy or look better on you or something like that. And in this way, especially when he talks about the dictatorship of the they, which is being unfolded, it's clear that he has a pretty negative stance towards this. He says every kind of priority gets noiselessly suppressed. He says thus the they maintains itself factically in the averageness of that which belongs to it, of that which it regards as valid and that which it does not, and of that to which it grants success and that to which it denies. And this term averageness, which is Durchschnittlichkeit, very, very long word, is translated as averageness. And he says the they has its own ways in which to be. That tendency of being with, which we have called distantiality, is grounded in the fact that being with one another concerns itself as such with averageness, which is an existential characteristic of the they. The they, in its being, essentially makes an issue of this. And he basically talks again about what dasman denies and what it validates. And I think another good translation of Durchschnittlichkeit is the status quo. In this way, we can see many of the ideas of Foucault finding their genesis in Heidegger. Of course, Foucault is taking his ideas from Nietzsche, and there's doubtless Nietzschean influence in Heidegger. Here we kind of see an allusion to the will to power, the idea that dasman is always trying to make Dasein subservient to it in its everydayness. And this is something that Foucault plays a lot on, of course, is this idea that we're basically constantly fighting against a power structure which is always trying to make itself known. He says distantiality, averageness, and leveling down. And he says, in terms of leveling down, this care of averageness reveals in turn an essential tendency of Dasein, which we call the leveling down of all possibilities of being. This is that suppression that happens from dasman, this leveling down which limits the possibilities of what you can do. Leveling down would be that impulse that almost restricts you to certain outfits to wear whenever you go out, because you feel the influence of dasman. He says, distantiality, averageness, and leveling down as ways of being, for that they constitute what we know as publicness. Publicness proximally controls every way in which the world and Dasein gets interpreted, and it is always right, not because there is some distinctive and primary relationship of being in which it is related to things, or because it avails itself of some transparency on the part of Dasein, which it has explicitly appropriated, but because it is insensitive to every difference of level and of genuineness, and thus never gets to the heart of the matter. By publicness, everything gets obscured, and what has thus been covered up gets passed off as something familiar and accessible to everyone. So basically, this is the idea that everything which is the status quo, certain things like fashion trends, almost become standard practice, and they stop being reflected on. And Heidegger mentions that we don't really get to the heart of the matter, auf die Sachen. And this is very interesting because it shows the ways in which Dasein relates itself to other Daseins within the world. And Heidegger is crucial to point out that the they is not merely a present at hand object. It is a mode of being of Dasein, but it's like a collective deficient mode of being. He says, it was always the they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. In Dasein's everydayness, the agency through which most things come about is one of which we must say that it was no one. And this is really interesting, because he's basically saying that dasman almost makes decisions for us, but dasman is such an empty term, it's so difficult to find a reference. Kind of like when someone uses the word they, but doesn't really specify what they're talking about, like, well, they say that blah, 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 insert some politically charged claim or something like that. We don't really know who this they is referring to, and it's kind of a weasel word like I talked about. And in this sense, we can understand what Heidegger means when he said, it was always the they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. In Dasein's everydayness, in its kind of normal being, the agency through which most things come about is one of which we must say it was no one. Which is interesting because he's kind of pointing out the deficient mode of this being, which is that no one's really making the decision. Dasein is being detracted from the ability to properly make a decision that's grounded, that actually gets to the heart of the matter. And then dasman is also making a claim, but it's a vapid claim that doesn't really mean anything. So, of course, this is the true problem with dasman, and this is kind of where we see Sartre take it to basically say hell is other people in No Exit. The main characters in No Exit are basically just tortured by one another. It's I think it's a guy and a girl and a lesbian girl all in hell, and it's just three couches, and they figure out that they are each other's hell, and that's where hell is other people comes from. And he says later that they is an existential, and as a primordial phenomenon, it belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. So dasman literally makes up what Dasein is, in the sense that it's kind of this thing that Salta says about existence preceding essence. Dasein is socialized into a scenario where it takes on certain identities based on the influence of dasman. He says, if Dasein is familiar with itself as they-self, this means at the same time that the they itself prescribes the way of interpreting the world in being in the world which lies closest. In terms of the they, and as the they, I am given proximally to myself. And that second sentence came a bit later, so don't be confused. They're not right next to each other. But this is very interesting, of the they giving yourself to yourself. I think this is a very interesting phenomenon that we can all relate to, which is the idea that it seems that part of our identity as people is manufactured by certain status quos and certain cultural norms that influence the way that we behave. This is kind of the idea of the difference between being male and being masculine. Being male, or kind of having the physical makeup of a male, versus masculinity. What that actually means is culturally influenced and created and stirs around in the decision-making consciousness of dasman. So I think this is a very interesting intersection in which we see where Heidegger's kind of doing a philosophical psychology in a way, but I think it has a bit more merit than someone like Lacan. And I think that's a good place to stop before we get in too much hot water with Lacan. But I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you learned something.